I love to tell the story of unseen things above, of Jesus and His glory, of Jesus and His love. I love to tell the story because I know 'tis true. It satisfies my longings as nothing else can do. I love to tell the story, 'twill be my theme in glory, to tell the old story of Jesus and His love.
Does anybody remember the name Brittany Maynard? Brittany, at the age of 29, had terminal brain cancer, a very vicious form of brain cancer, and decided that she wanted to end her life rather than suffer through the pain that would go with it. And Brittany lived in California. And of course, you do not have physician-assisted suicide in California at that time. So she moved to Oregon. And on November 1st, the date that she declared that she wanted to end her life, she got the permission from the doctors in Oregon and got the medication and took her life on November 1st. Now, the people of California were sufficiently embarrassed that, being the progressive state that it is, that they would not let Brittany die in California, that she had to go to Oregon to do that. So California passed the End of Life Option Act, which basically is giving the person the right to commit suicide and receive assistance from a physician to do that. So Brittany did that. It was described in the newspaper as she surrounded herself with friends and took a pill, and 5 minutes later went to sleep, and shortly after that died peacefully. A recent survey shows that more than 2/3 of Americans believe that you should have the right to end your life with the assistance of a physician at your choice. 2/3. That may include some people here. So I think it's important for us to look at this in a biblical way. What does Scripture tell us about this problem of ending life? And it's an issue in the lives of people. Now, we know that there are other countries in Europe, for example, where it happens quite regularly. One of the things that I find intriguing about all this is we're okay in general in this country with giving somebody a pill and saying, here's a good death, here's a good peaceful death for you if you want to go this route. But yet we seem to not be able to find a way to execute prisoners who have been sentenced to death. Because just recently, didn't some states put the death penalty on hold because of the problems with the drugs they were using to inject the person who was going to be executed? It was an unreasonable death. It was just too much pain associated with it. Yet in Holland, their citizens killed themselves, with 6,000 of them killed themselves with injections from a physician, and that was presented as a painless, easy death. Which is it? Is this physician-assisted suicide so peaceful and easy that anybody would want to do that? Or is it something that is so difficult and may cause excruciating pain for a long period of time and maybe not even be successful in the end? Anyway, that's just an interesting question that came through my mind as I looked at this. I'm going to leave you with a lot of questions today, I hope. But the issue here is not just this. It's not just prisoners. It's not just people deciding to end their lives. We're going to consider this morning Saul's death, because this is a suicide. It is an ending of life, and it fits right into a lot of the stuff that we've talked about here so far this morning, and fits in with problems being faced by people that you know, I'm sure. And if you don't know them now, you will know them soon, and maybe even something that you'll experience in your own life. But we're going to talk about that. Before that, let's look at some questions. When we look at this issue, one of the phrases that comes up frequently is quality of life. Quality of life. And that's a nice nebulous term that floats around out there, and we can all form our own opinions about what that is. But if you're going to try to measure quality of life, how would you measure quality of life?
Toys I have.
How many toys I have. Many people do measure that way. How else do people measure the quality of life? Health. Intellectual capacity. Dementia reduces a person's quality of life in the eyes of some. Last Thursday night in this room, Joseph Wheat from Highland Presbyterian met with the men of the church who decided to gather on Thursday night. In his talk, he quoted Francis Schaeffer. And I'm going to paraphrase what Joseph said that Francis said. And that is that when we measure quality of life, the way most people measure quality of life, it's based upon two things, peace and prosperity. You see, if we have a lot of peace in our lives, that allows us to do what we want to do. If you don't have peace in your life, if you're a Christian in Syria, for example, how much opportunity do you have to do the things that you want to do? We're severely limited, right? Or in any Muslim country, if you're a practicing Christian in a Muslim country, how free are you to do the things that you want to do? Well, probably not very free. So if we're going to have what many of us would call high quality of life, we want to have a lot of peace in our life so that we can do what we want to do. And prosperity, we want to have the toys, so we want to be able to do what we want to do as much as we want to do it. And the only way we can do that is if we have sufficient resources for doing it, right? We have to have an abundance of resources, at least a sufficient amount to do everything that we want to do. And that's a different amount for each of us. But if we have sufficient peace and sufficient prosperity, then we'll say that our quality of life is high. But if one of those things is not adequate in our eyes, then we're going to say, well, our quality of life has diminished and it's not where it needs to be. I think that Schaeffer hit it pretty close. I'm not saying that's the definition and that's all that there is, but I'm saying that it does tell us a lot about ourselves. Why are some people so eager to end their lives? What reasons do people have for wanting to end their lives? 6,000 people in Holland did last year.
They have the misconception that suffering ends at death.
Ah, good point. They have the misconception that suffering can end at death. Because that's, in fact, a lot of people do look at that, don't they? They are suffering. I can end the suffering by ending my life. But does everyone's suffering end at the end of their life on this earth? Not if you understand that there is a hell where the suffering is infinitely greater than anything a person might suffer on this earth. Why else might people want to end their lives?
Loss of self-esteem. My life isn't worth anything.
For whatever reasons, my life has lost meaning. I don't feel that I have any value. But it comes down to pain and suffering, doesn't it? It comes down to I'm feeling so much pain that I just can't function and I just can't take it anymore, or I have suffering of some kind. Even what you described is suffering, isn't it? It's what some people call existential suffering, because I'm suffering over my existence. I'm suffering because I don't have any meaning in my life. I don't see that my life has any purpose, and so therefore I'm suffering. So there are all kinds of suffering. It doesn't have to be physical. It can be mental, emotional.
They want to take the stress off their caregivers.
Okay, that is true also. They would say, okay, I don't want to be a burden, and so I will end my life to remove the burden from them. However, does it work that way all the time? No. The burden they actually put on the people that they leave behind can be tremendous, and much more than the burden they thought that they were while they were there. An important point when you talk about pain and suffering is, how does pain and suffering affect the way that you think? Have you ever had a terrific toothache, for example, or a kidney stone, or shingles, or any of these other things that cause tremendous pain? When you were in the middle of that, could you sit down and read War and Peace? You couldn't even read the newspaper, could you? Because you couldn't focus on anything. So if a person is in the midst of tremendous pain and tremendous suffering, how clearly are they thinking about ending their lives? They aren't. And you'll see it today in our lesson. I would say that everyone in here at some point in time, when hearing about the death of a particular individual and the way that they died, has said, that's the way I want to go. Have you ever done that? How was it? How did you want to go?
Painless.
Painless. No pain, no suffering. No pain, no suffering. We don't want any of that. So a good death to people in general is one with no pain, no suffering. I just want to go to bed, go to sleep, and not wake up. Now, we all know people who have done that, who have gone to bed, gone to sleep, and just didn't wake up in the morning. And we have said almost every time, almost every one of us has said then, that's the way I want to go. What about a Christian in a Muslim country who refuses to renounce his faith and gets his head taken off in front of a camera after he's been tortured for a couple of weeks? He gets his head chopped off in front of a camera and recorded for the world to see. Is that a good death? Now, see, most of us, if we weren't in Sunday school, would say, no, I don't want that. Because there's too much pain, there's too much suffering associated with that, and I don't want it. But that might be a better death than going to bed and going to sleep. Just something to think about. Another phrase that you hear quite often is the right to die. What does that mean? Can anybody walk up and say, you do not have the right to die. You cannot die. That's almost what it implies, right? I mean, if people say I'm being refused the right to die, well, that's nonsense. You will die unless one major event takes place before that naturally happens. For most of us, we can expect to die. So what does this mean?
Die prematurely.
When people use the phrase, the right to die, they're not saying prematurely. It is, in fact, a premature death. They're doing it ahead of its natural state. But what do they mean by right to die?
Choose.
Right to choose. That's right. We're into this choice thing. You know, we have this big deal in this country, particularly about having the right to choose what we want to do, when we want to do it, how we want to do it, and just get out of my way, including my death. So it is about that. But now what they really mean is even more than that. It's not just a matter of me deciding that I want to die and then going ahead and doing it whenever I want. But I don't want you to judge me about it either. I mean, don't you dare say anything bad about me because I want to end my life. Because that's my right. I have the right to choose. And if you want to make some moral judgment about that, then shame on you. That's what they're saying. Not only should I be able to do it when I want to do it, how I want to do it, and not only should you not judge me, but you should help me. You should help me. I should be able to have a physician come and help me do this so that we can make this as pain-free as possible, with as little suffering as possible. So I want you to give me a physician. I want a physician to help me. Wait a minute, what about the Hippocratic Oath? When asked, I will not give this life-ending medicine to a person. And I won't even suggest it. But how serious are we about oaths these days? How many politicians have you seen put their hand on a Bible and swear, I will uphold the Constitution of the United States? How many judges and politicians have done that and turn right around and the next day do something that is contrary to the Constitution of the United States? So there are physicians who would take the Hippocratic Oath and will turn around and do that. One of the things that you have to think about that the right to die people don't want to talk about normally is the obligation to die. How does this transition to obligation to die? How do you get from everybody having the right to die the way that they want to die to you having an obligation to die prematurely? You see, one of the ways that this is already being talked about is that these right to die laws require too much. You have to be mentally present. If you are insane or if you have any dementia, then you are not going to be allowed to go through this process because you can't logically make the decision yourself to do it. So all the people with dementia can't have this. And the old wise people in the world who look out at us and say, well, we know what's best for everybody, can say, well, obviously the people with dementia should not have to endure all these problems that they have to face with the diminished mental capacity, and so we should help them. And the way that we'll help them is we'll end their lives. Does that sound like maybe that has some history to it at all? What did the Nazis do? The Nazis didn't just kill Jews. They also killed those with diminished mental capacity, also those with physical handicaps. I mean, anybody had a handicap to the ovens. The phrase used by Marx and by Hitler and by many others is, Worthless eaters. People who are consuming but providing nothing. You see, that quickly translates into anybody who's retired. Worthless eaters, right? They're consuming and producing nothing. Now we chuckle, but these things can be easily extended. What does the right to die have to do with control? I have purposely put up here the living will or the health care directive, and probably most people in here have a living will or health care directive. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. What does all this have to do with control? What does the right to die have to do with control?
Population control.
Well, all right, it can be that. We can, in fact, control the worthless eaters so we don't have too many of those. So we can eliminate those. And so you come up then with an obligation to die. I mean, these people are obligated to die because they're just consuming. They're destroying the earth and producing nothing, so we need to get rid of them. I think there are two reasons for having a living will. One of them good, one not good. The not good is control. I mean, we're just control freaks. We want to control everything in our lives. I mean, that's when we're happiest anyway, isn't it? When we're controlling everything that's going on in our lives. I mean, when you're in full control of what's going on, aren't you then most satisfied? At least you think you are. But when somebody else has control over something in your life, then you're not really feeling fulfilled. If that's the case, we want control. And the living will, for the purpose of having control, is not a good thing, because that's just feeding our ego. With that living will, that healthcare directive, you do not have full control because you don't know every possible circumstance that may come up. And that living will may do something quite contrary to what you want to have when that circumstance arises. But there is a good reason for having a living will, a healthcare directive, is because of the progress of medicine, there are situations where they can keep you alive forever if they choose to.
You're not really alive.
That's the way that we would put it. That's a machine that's working through our bodies and that. So the healthcare directive to put a limit on what medicine can do to us is a reasonable thing to do. We try to keep that from becoming too obtrusive. But if we use it for the fact that we want to maintain control, then we're barking up the wrong tree. Film clip this morning is from Grey's Anatomy. And once you get past a lot of the sex scenes between the doctors, sometimes they have some pretty good points. And this particular scene this morning has, from season 10, episode 17, Dr. Yang here is performing open heart surgery on a patient, and the person's been injured in the car crash. She's performing open heart surgery.
All it takes is one person, one patient, one moment to change your life forever. Ross? A moment that forces you to reevaluate everything you think you know.
MVC victim. Wants you to take a look at the C-spine x-rays.
Know who you are.
Patient C3 and 4 obliterated. His spinal cord is severed. There's no way I can repair that.
Do you know what's happened to you?
But so, he's lost all motor function from the neck down. Man's paralyzed.
Do you want to live this way?
You're saying he's paralyzed?
Yes. I am so sorry. But his brain function is good, and I was able to fully repair his heart.
Is his diaphragm working? Can he breathe on his own?
No, he's currently on a ventilator. We can discuss.
Will he ever breathe on his own again?
No, he will not.
Okay, I need you to wake him up. Right now. You can do that, right?
Elise, your husband just underwent major surgery.
I know, and now I'm asking you to wake him up. And I need you to ask him if he wants you to remove the vent.
Well, the vent is breathing for him. It's what's keeping him alive.
The last thing I thought when I woke up this morning was I'd lose Jason. I understand what I'm asking. Believe me, I don't want to lose him. I know him. I know everything about him. I understand, and I don't think he would want this. I know it. I think he would rather die than live one more minute hooked up to a machine.
Do you know who you are? Do you know where you are? Do you know what has happened to you? You were in a car accident. Your vehicle was hit from behind, and you flipped over into oncoming traffic. You're in a hospital right now. I want to make sure you understand what this means. The ventilator is breathing for you. That means once it's removed, you will not be able to breathe on your own. Now, if you can't breathe, you will die. It might take a few hours, probably less. Do you understand this?
Oh, God.
Do you still want me to remove the vent?
I won't tell you how they decided that, but you can see by this example that we are all one eye blink away from being in the position of having this life-death decision. It's not a matter of age, although the older we get, the closer we get to having that decision, but it can happen to anybody at any time. Our story is about Saul's death, and it is a suicide. Saul's been king for 35 years when we enter the story. He's been the first king of Israel, 35 years. They have been in the land for 360 years. This is the first time they've had a king. We still have to go 90 years from that point in time till the time that Solomon completes the temple. So there's no temple in Jerusalem yet. Jerusalem's not the capital yet. And Saul's death will be 5 years later. So we're going to start with 35 years into Saul's reign, look at what happens there, then we're going to jump ahead to the 5 years to Saul's death. Now we're going to look at the Amalekites, and I'll come back to them in just a second. These are descendants of Esau, down here below Israel, below the Dead Sea. And as we end the story, the Philistines are going to enter back in as they harass the people of Israel the whole time. They are natives of this. They were there before the Israelites came across the Jordan 360 years before. And the Philistines and the Israelites are going to have a little battle up around Gilboa, and there's one little other town that you will hear about, Endor, and that's just up above Gilboa, between Gilboa and the Sea of Galilee. So that's the picture. So as we look at this, 35 years into Saul's reign, God has told Saul to go down and destroy the Amalekites. Had enough of that? It's time for them to be wiped out. And so this is where the story picks up. After Saul has gone down there, and they pretty well have wiped everybody out, he brings the king back with him, and they bring back some of the animals that they weren't supposed to bring. So as the story begins in the background here, what we have is Samuel approaching Saul saying, look, you have messed up big time now because God told you to go down and do this a certain way. You did not do that. And so Saul starts making excuses about everything. Well, it wasn't me, it was the people, and the people, da-da-da. Well, first of all, he says, I didn't sin, man, I'm clean. I did what you wanted. Saul is trying to weasel out of the whole thing. Samuel says, no, you messed up, and God has rejected you as king of Israel. You rejected God's word by not doing what he said, and now God has rejected you as king of Israel. Now remember, Saul's going to be king of Israel for 5 more years. But God's telling him, I've rejected you. It'd be like working for somebody. You have this position. He says, okay, you no longer have that position in my organization, but yet you keep going back to work every day. You get the same paycheck and you have some of the responsibilities. People start treating you a little differently because they all know that the boss doesn't really like you anymore. But for 5 years, can you imagine doing that for 5 years? Well, that's what Saul's doing as king. God's rejected him, and it becomes apparent to everybody over time that that's what's happened. So we have the rejection of Saul as king of Israel. That's chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. We jump to chapter 16, where Samuel then is sent by God to go anoint David to be the king. And when Samuel anoints David to be the king, the Holy Spirit comes upon David. God pours his Spirit on David and takes his Spirit away from Saul. Saul, yes, he still has the crown. He's still going to work. People are still bowing down to him. But in fact, the Spirit has been taken away. And a harmful spirit has been given to him to harass him the rest of his days. And you'll see this as we go forward. But does anybody remember Psalm 51:11? This is where David says to God, don't cast me away from you, out of your presence. And don't take your Holy Spirit away from me. When you see what David sees over the next 5 years, you understand what David's saying in that song. Don't do to me what you did to Saul. Because over those next 5 years and to the end, it was pretty miserable for Saul because that Holy Spirit had been taken away and a harmful spirit had been given to him. And David says, please don't do that to me. Now we jump ahead 5 years. In this 5-year period, we're told very quickly, first of all, to Saul's credit, he has already removed the wizards and the witches and the magicians and the mediums and all these hocus-pocus people out of the land. And that's to his credit. You see, in those first 35 years, Saul did some pretty good things because the Holy Spirit was with him and he was working with Saul, helping Saul do things, enabling Saul to do things. And so Saul did some pretty good things. But once the Spirit is away, it's all downhill for Saul. So Saul has done that. But Samuel has died. The number one prophet has died. He's gone. He's not there anymore. David, Saul's been chasing around, and at this point in time, 5 years later, David is living with the Philistines. David's living with the enemy. In fact, he's pretty tight with the top guy. So that's the situation. Then the Philistines start to move. So you jump to, this is chapter 28 of 1 Samuel. Philistines start to move, and they go up to Gilboa, right in the heart of Israel. They march up there. And so Saul has to get out there with his army and go try to meet these guys. And as he looks out on the army of the Philistines, he's filled with a spirit of fear. He is trembling with fear because he sees this huge army. He is feeling powerless because he has no power because God's Spirit has left him. He is left with this harmful spirit. And so he is terrified by what he sees. He sees the army and he's terrified. It looks like he might do the right thing next. He wants God's help. Well, we all get there, don't we? If things are bad enough for us, if things really look hopeless, then we might go to him. That's when Saul went. What's he been doing for 5 years? He's had 5 years to deal with this, and he hasn't. So he wants God's help. So he can't depend upon the priest because not only is Samuel gone, but not too far back in time, he had almost 80 priests of Nob killed because he wasn't happy with them. He thought they were helping David too much, so had them all executed. So he's not getting any help from the priests. God wasn't giving him any dreams to give him any guidance because God has rejected him. God rejected him as king 5 years ago. God's rejecting him as a man now because it has reached the point of no return. So he resorts to witchcraft. Now here's the man, here's the king who drove all the witches and the mediums and the hocus-pocus people out of the land. And things have gotten so bad from him and God's not talking to him, so he decides, get me a witch. And they say, well, there's one left up at Endor. She's been hiding up there. You didn't get her out. And so that's fine. He says, let's go. So in the middle of the night, he disguises himself and goes up to Endor to meet with the witch of Endor. And he gets a message. And we won't go into the details of this. She's a medium. She's going to call up a spirit of the dead. So she calls up Samuel at Saul's request. It's interesting. If you look at that, did Saul ever see Samuel? And I won't answer that question. But just when you read all that, look at the words. See if you think Saul ever saw Samuel. This vision of Samuel. This vision comes up, and the message from the vision is that what Samuel told you in real life 5 years ago is that the kingdom's being taken away from you. It's being given to David. That's what's going to happen. Not only is that going to happen, it's going to happen tomorrow because the Philistines are going to defeat your army tomorrow, and you and your sons will die tomorrow. Well, that's the vision that is given, and it turns out to be pretty accurate. Now, when Saul hears that, he's been on his face, bowing to the ground on his face, and when he hears this, he just falls flat. He is just totally defeated and depressed. All right, so the battle takes place. Everything goes pretty much as stated. The Philistine army comes up, chases off the Israeli army. Saul's sons are killed. He watches his sons die. Saul clearly believed what the vision told him, that he's going to die also. Then he gets hit with an arrow and seriously wounded by this shot. Seriously wounded. Anybody remember what happened to Samson? Samson was one of the last judges, so clearly in the memory of Saul and all the people this time, because that wasn't too far back in history. But Samson was, after his little incident with Delilah, was captured by the Philistines. His eyes were gouged out, and they put him to work like an ox because he was strong. Let's use the strength, and so they humiliated him by having him perform the work of an animal. And they would have him come in and do shows for them on occasion. Now, how's that for a man of such great power and strength? The humiliation, is that pain and suffering, by the way? It's its own kind of pain and suffering, isn't it? Saul says, I don't want that. I don't want the Philistines to do to me what I'm pretty sure they're going to do if they get a hold of me. So what he wants to do is he wants to die with dignity. He wants to be able to choose his death. He doesn't want it to go with pain and suffering. Now, he already has enough pain and suffering. He doesn't want any more pain and suffering. Now, isn't that what we all say? You know, that when we say we want to go to sleep and not wake up, and we want this death with dignity, because, you know, if we get too much pain and suffering, we might not be too dignified as we go through that suffering. We might behave in a way that wouldn't make us proud or would make others proud of us. If we can avoid that, then maybe we have a shot. I want death with dignity. So what's he say? He says to his armor bearer, finish me off. Finish me off. Take your sword and run it through me, and so I won't have to put up with this from the Philistines. In other words, doctor, give me the pill. Doctor, give me the injection so that I don't have to go through this. So he wants to die with dignity. The armor bearer refuses to do it. So Saul chooses a better death, not what he wanted. He wanted the armor bearer to do it for him. He wanted the doctor to give him the shot. He didn't have to do it himself. So he says, okay, I'll do it myself. So he takes his sword, he falls on his sword, and kills himself. And then to make matters even worse, the armor bearer with him falls on his sword. He follows Saul's example. You ever think that whatever you do at the end of your life might be an example for somebody else at the end of theirs? So he chooses a better death and falls on his sword. Now, the interesting thing comes to the next section, and it says that the next day the Philistines came to strip the bodies. Now, wait a minute. Saul was concerned that the Philistines were coming in and going to do all this stuff to him, and they didn't come for hours and hours and hours, all through the night. It wasn't until the next day that they came in to do all this. It is possible that Saul, had he not fallen on his sword, might have died a natural death from the wound that he had. Or the armor bearer may have been able to get him back to safety where he may have died from some other reason. When you are told that you have a week to live, does that mean you have 7 days? It might be 30 days. It might be a year. You don't know what God is going to do with the rest of that time. Even if Saul had killed himself, the armor bearer had plenty of time to take the body of Saul away and bury it. The conclusion I have for you is from Moses talking to the people, getting ready to lead them into the land, and he's given them the law, and he says, I've presented to you death and life. I presented to you death and life. Life is choosing God, believing God, trusting God, obeying God, leaning on God, holding on to Him. Choose life. That's what Moses tells them. Choose life. That's all it is. It's believing God, holding on to Him. And that's the same message that we have with the cross. We are to choose life. God is sovereign over life and death. When Saul took his life on Mount Gilboa, he was saying, God's not sovereign, I'm taking charge here. God is sovereign over life and over death. Full control. When I choose to take control of my death, I am denying God's sovereignty. That's the message that's clear. I mean, you can get all kinds of other things, and you can think all kinds of other things, but the message is that God is sovereign over life and death, and for me to take control of my death is to deny Him His sovereignty. And I cannot control my death any more than I can control my life. He is sovereign over both, and I have to trust Him.
I love to tell the story 'Twill be my theme in glory to tell the old story of Jesus and his love.